on that note, you also talk about Ukraine and leadership and Zelensky. And I think there's a brilliant line where you talk about realising when Russia invaded, what he had to provide first was an authentic narrative of resistance, inspiring his people by his example of remaining in Kyiv and giving Ukrainians a historic account of their nation to which they could rally, which I think is really interesting because that sort of, you're saying that he's an actor, he was playing a role, but it worked in that case.
And he had the good sense, if you like, the innate statesmanship to realise that's the first thing that the leader must produce, is that narrative. Otherwise it's collapse. France in 1940 didn't have that narrative. Britain had, because Churchill, famously using his rhetoric, produced his blood, sweat and tears speech. But both Zelensky and Churchill didn't make the boosterism mistake. They didn't just rely on talking up the situation.
Well, let's move on to Boris Johnson.
They actually did the hard work.
Yeah.
I mean, in Churchill's case, getting Beaverbrook in to really shake up aircraft production. In Zelensky's case, meticulous detail in getting his armed forces the equipment they need to survive.
Now, Jane Garvey's obsessed with the threat of nuclear war. I'm obsessed with Sweden. So we both very much enjoyed the part of your book where you talk about the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, which has distributed all of these leaflets in 2018 to households asking, if crisis or war comes, what would you do if your everyday life was turned upside down? And you've actually reproduced, I think, some of the list, the Swedish list for us. Well, first of all, why don't we have one in the UK? And second of all, what's on your list for the listeners?
Well, let me first acknowledge the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, MSB, who were kind enough to say, yes, you can actually show the British public what we have already shown the Swedish public. They have always felt that defence, in its widest sense, is an all-of-nation business, civil as well as military. And of course, they have lived for many years fearing Russia. And probably in terms of public opinion, they were more confident.
Right.
Now, when I was Security Intelligence Coordinator after 9/11, we did persuade the British government to let us send a booklet to every household in the country. It was quite short, much shorter than the Swedish one.
Yeah, did we? Because I don't remember that.
Well, it's surprising how many people do.
Okay.
And when there was a follow-up survey, we discovered that an awful lot of households had pinned this little booklet with the essential telephone numbers to ring in an emergency beside the telephone.
Right.
In the days, of course, when houses had
landlines.
fixed landlines. I may say it took quite a lot of persuasion to get ministers to allow us to do that, because there was an underlying fear we might spook the public. It would look like panicky somehow because the terrorism threat was very public and very evident. We had the same, I remember, in persuading ministers to allow us to run a full-scale live exercise of a terrorist attack on the Underground, which we did by taking over Bank Station at a weekend.
Yeah.
But once ministers had sort of said, well, you really need to, we really need to test those procedures, the sensible decision was made. In that case, you'd better make it very public, and we'll have, I think it was Sky TV, actually filming.
So there could be no discussion at all about the possibility of this being done in secret. It was utterly open, right?
Or being done, to frighten the public so you can get some new legislation through Parliament.
When there were terrible terrorist attacks on the Underground, did people benefit from that incident?
Hugely.
They did, yeah.
There were things uncovered, which everyone knew about, but it became rather dramatically uncovered, which took much longer to fix. So, for example, mobile phone didn't work underground. The 3 emergency services didn't all have the same radio equipment. That's been fixed. And so over the years, a lot of the obvious vulnerabilities have been put right. But thank goodness we did conduct that exercise, which also involved the hospitals mobilizing to take emergency, the casualties and so on. That's the sort of area that I think we do very well.
Yeah.
It is regularly practiced and rehearsed, but the Ariana Grande concert attack showed that even so, we can be tested, and the inquest found, I'm afraid, that some of the emergency service response wasn't as good as it should have been.
So you also talk in the book about the sort of we have managed to reduce numbers of terrorist attacks on things like hostage situations in the air, but obviously those threats have been replaced by other sorts of threats now, and you talk about one of the biggest threats being cyber attacks, and not just to large firms that might have a great infrastructure, but also all companies and small companies too. In a nutshell, if you're a business owner, how can you prevent, or how can you try to prevent, or do your very best to prevent cyber attacks?
First step is anticipation. So think about what actually would happen if suddenly all the screens went black. You can't get access to your customers' data or your suppliers' data. You've been subject to a ransomware attack. And up pops a screen saying, in Bitcoin, please pay so many £1,000.
This will be chilling the blood all over the nation, this. But anyway, carry on, David.
But it happens
I know,
every day.
Yeah.
And this is not the great Chinese state or the Russian state. A lot of this is straightforward criminality. Some is, has some state assistance too. But the point I'm making is that you have to visualize. What's it going to be like? What am I going to do? Who's going to be in charge? What happens if I'm away on holiday and this happens? And you kind of work through in your mind. And then you probably say to the small team, if it's a small or medium-sized enterprise, can we exercise this? And let's work out which one of us is going to go on the radio and explain.
Be upfront about it.
Explain.
Yes.
And then you can start thinking, well, if we did get into, which company would we turn to try and get technical support? Because if you're a small or medium-sized company, you're not going to have that in-house. You'll have to buy it in. So would it be a good idea to have a dormant contract with such a company that in an emergency you can say, right, here we are, come and rescue us? This is not rocket science. This is very, very basic contingency planning. But unless you've kind of lived it in your mind, you're going to get caught out when it does happen.
I think that's your book in a nutshell, really, and your advice, isn't it? We should say it's not all negative or critical. You are very, very clear that the London Olympics were a triumph, and because they were properly planned, nothing went wrong, and it was a period of, I think, incredible happiness, actually, for all those of us who remember it. So it's not all negative by any stretch.
Oh, it certainly isn't.
No.
And I don't want to be portrayed as
No.
just seeing the dark side. But the lesson, of course, of the 2012 Olympics is how much effort by a great many people in different organisations had to go in. But at the point of the opening ceremony, and of course every criminal group, every terrorist group around the world knew exactly, to the minute when that ceremony would start. Probably our national resilience to something happening, and of course remember the torch relay was all around the country, so something happening was probably at a peak. It's probably gone back downhill a bit since then.